Welcome to INTL is your superhero. It's my superhero as well. I tend to like every week find something on the web platform, and I will say it's my favorite feature. This has been my favorite feature for a while now, and the great thing about working on this presentation is that I didn't think I knew everything about this spec, but I thought I knew most of it, and I ran into like thing after thing after thing that I had no idea that it existed, and just made me happier and happier. Real quick, I am Raymond Camden. I am a senior developer evangelist for Adobe, focused on APIs related to PDFs and also Firefly. Nothing at all about what I'm talking about today. If you have any questions, you can reach me at my website, raymondcamden.com. You can also send me an email, raymondcamden@gmail.com, and I love to get your emails on stuff. So you will absolutely not be bothering me if you ask a question about what I'm showing today. If you want a copy of this presentation, I won't ask you to scan the QR code. You're watching a live stream. You can watch the recording later and just pause. But it is up on my GitHub. And I will say the repository is only the slide deck because all of the examples are up on CodePen. So my agenda today is just to explain what is the INTL feature, spec, etc. Talk about what it isn't as well, and then run through lots and lots of examples. And again, you'll have access to all these demos that you can run yourself whenever you want. So what is it? It is a namespace object, and that's just a fancy way of saying, multiple things. Most of the web platform things I do tend to be like very focused on one particular thing. INTL is focused on internationalization type things. That's one thing, but it really has like a lot of moving parts beneath it. So namespace object kind of represents the fact that we'll have a lot of features we're covering today. It supports internationalization of numbers and dates, and it's probably, if you've heard of INTL, you've heard of that. But it also has some string-related functions as well, including helping you with locale-specific string comparison and much, much more. Again, I went into preparing this slide deck thinking I knew most of the spec, and I found out that I did not. So you can actually look at the specification if you want. It's going to be a very long read and very, very exciting. I'm linking to it just in case you want to check it out. It is very well supported on the browser and definitely in Node.js. There is, I think, only one exception I'll have today for Firefox. But outside of that, it's just going to plain work, and it's totally safe. So what it is not, and this is pretty important, it is not translation. So it's not going to take a block of text and translate it to a local language for you. If you follow my blog, you know that Google is working on a translation API built into the browser itself using GenAI, but that's probably 6 months or more out before it sees the light of day and may never hit non-Chromium browsers. It's also not going to internationalize your UI for you. So it's not like you could just say, hey, make this page magically work okay in Europe. You actually have to do the work of finding the elements that need to be localized and then using this API. It's also not currency exchange, and I'll explain what that means when we get to currency in a minute. I have a little funny story about how I screwed that up. General syntax. You will make a new instance of intl.something. You will figure out the user's locale or not specify because it'll just default to their own locale. And you can actually pass a string or an object that gets a bit more fancy, and the browser will do its best based on the input. And basically what that means is that there's definitely some language variants that have like root families where you may be a particular type of French, for example. And if for some reason the browser doesn't support it, it can at least fall back to a more general French. That gets pretty complex. Most of my examples today are going to use the default, or sometimes I do French just to show it. And then you run a method, and almost always it's going to be format. So in terms of figuring out the user's language, you don't have to work for that. That is a built-in browser feature, navigator.language. You also have an array, navigator.languages, which allows the browser to say, hey, my primary language is English. I can also speak French in a pinch, and I can kind of get by in Spanish. It's actually a priority list of languages that you can support, and your code can look at that and say, you know what, I don't support their #1 language, but I support their #2. There's also a HTTP header, but don't forget JavaScript doesn't have access to that. If you want to use that header and you're using a server-side language like Cold Fusion, you could detect that header, and when you render the page out, actually include it in there in dynamically generated results. So just as an example, this is a code pin. I'm on my browser. I speak English. You can see navigator.languages is returning. It is an array, but when I print it out, it's going to be a string showing my #1 priority, US English, and then the second priority, just English. What you should not do is use the IP location of the user. So if you've ever done international travel and you open up your laptop, which is set to US English, and you go to your website and you see French, and you're like, what the heck? That's because a lot of websites will look at your IP and say, oh, they're in France. Obviously, they speak French, even though their browser is telling me they only speak English. Don't do that. Don't be those people. And most of all, don't force them into one language. If you are doing some sniffing, give some options in terms of, you know, hey, I detected this, but you could switch to this language instead. So let's talk about date formatting. This is what got me into this spec. It was the first feature that I really cared about. It will be in the intl.datetime format object. You do dates, times, or both at the same time. Has multiple baked-in styles, and you can also format ranges as well. And this was a new discovery for me. As an example of how easy this is, you make a date object in JavaScript, and then you can literally say, create an instance of intl datetime format, run the format function on that date, and we get a format. Because I am in America, that's my locale. It's doing month, day, year. Now, if I wanted to, I could actually specify I always want to use UK English instead. And for that, it does the, let's be honest, logical day, month, year instead. Now, that's with no options at all, just kind of the default rendering. If we want to get more fancy, we can do things like actually create that object. I was kind of creating the object and then immediately throwing it away by running format on it. I can save that object. As you can see, I'm doing right there. Let formatter equals new intl datetime format, and then use it for multiple dates. So I have an object for today and an object for tomorrow, and that renders what you would expect. Today is the 12th. 13th is tomorrow. Some of the options you could specify are things like locale, what calendar system to use, and numbering system. So I had an abstract idea of that there were multiple calendars out there. I knew the China had a different calendar. I knew of like one or two, but when I looked at the spec, I was kind of like shocked because there is like, I'm not going to count live here, but that's like 20 different types of calendars. So not even counting numbering systems, but you can get that precise with this specification. You can also do things, and this is pretty cool. Maybe in France, you always use a 24-hour locale, but maybe you want to not do that for whatever reason. You want to turn that off. You can tweak that in the options. You could tweak showing time zone as well. Even more options, you could say, hey, show a weekday, show the error, which is like BCAD, year, month, etc. Day period, another thing I just found out about while researching for this, that is what part of the day it is, morning, afternoon, and evening. I had no clue that they had that as a part of the spec. You can say if you care about hours, seconds, even fractional seconds as well. And there's also some kind of nice default aliases for full, long, medium, and short if you don't want to get super specific. In use, this is what it looks like. When I create my formatter object, I pass a set of options. In this case, I'm using the built-in aliases for date and time for long, and you will see it is fairly verbose. And I could also do a short format as well, and it is shorter. No big surprise there. I did build a code pin that allows you to play with this if you want to see this in action. So I picked the 21st. Daytime is full, time is full. If you set time to null, it shows just the date. No big surprise there. If you set date to null, it shows just the time. And you can mix and match these. Like I kind of like the medium time style and the medium date style. You can just kind of go crazy with this in terms of what you're doing. By the way, I'm not going to talk about all the lines of code here since mainly it is look at these DOM items, get the values, and renders it. The code that you care about is right here where I create my options based on those drop downs. I create my formatter, and then I just render out a formatted version of the date and time that I picked in that little input field there. So if you want to break it down and not use the aliases, full, long, etc., you can get specific. You can see here I have year, month, day, and day period. No second, so that won't show up. And you can see it is November 12th. It is the year 24. That's 2-digit, and that day period is evening. Like I said, this was one of the things I just discovered. I played a bit with it. I think, at least in America, at 6 p.m., it switches to evening. Before that, it's afternoon. I think morning starts at like 6 a.m. I definitely want to blog about this and see if it changes in different locales. But they do have some logic for morning, afternoon, evening, and so forth. So date range formatting takes 2 dates. You can technically pass one if you want. The same formatting options that you just saw works over here as well. And it will display the range between them intelligently. And what do I mean by that? Let's go to the code pen. So I'm going to pick the 11th at now, and we will pick the 16th at now as well. And using full, it's very, very long. Let's make this a little bit less. But you could see there, it shows the time, it shows the range. If I turn time off, it intelligently knows, like, I only need to do November because both dates are in the same month. If I were to go back to October, you can see it recognizes immediately that, oh, I need to actually show the month. Now, what's cool about this is if I go and I pick October 22nd, I can read like that. Because I have time style off, it knows not to do the little dash in the middle. That's what I'm talking about, this being intelligent. Really handy little API there, I think. Works very, very well. You can read more at the docs. I'm just including that link there if you grab these slides later. Relative date formatting uses INTL, relative time format, describes a time in the past or the future. And that's, basically like, oh, this is going to happen in so many hours, or this happened so many days ago. Supports number and unit, and you'll see an example of what that means in a minute. You can also specify that you care about years, quarters, months, weeks, etc. And you could turn off numeric answers. So if the relative time was 0 minutes, you may want to render that as now, or you may want to render that as 0 minutes, and the API supports that. So this is an example where I create my formatter object, and basically all you pass is a unit. Like that's it. Like I want to format 1 day ago or 1 minute in the future, and you see 1 day ago and in 1 minute. If we play with this, so in 1 year, in the long format, we see in 1 year. If I make that short, it abbreviates it. If I do narrow, it makes it smaller. Numeric, always. If I switch it to auto, it goes to next year. If I go to 2, it switches to 2 years. So it gets a little bit fancy here. If I do 0, it is this year, or I could say in 0 years. Again, very, very flexible. We could switch to hours and say this hour. I believe if I do this second, yeah, it switches to now, versus this minute is this minute. Again, this is all kind of baked in, pretty powerful stuff. Now, you may be asking, given that I have date A and then I have date B, how do I know what units to pick? So what do you pick? Do I pick days? Like if I want to show on my website how many days till Christmas and it is January, should I do weeks, months? Should I do days? Typically for Christmas, people do days. But when it is, let's say, Christmas Eve, do I do hours? Like how do you do this? What number do you use? Unfortunately, there's no thing for that. You have to figure it out. And I did a blog post talking about some of this, about how you figure it out. It really kind of boils down to it depends on what your event is, what you're trying to show. If you go to that blog post, I actually built a function that tries to intelligently tell you what units to pick. But it is going to be something that you have to figure out yourself. So again, I linked to the docs if you want to see more about that. By the way, all those links are on the Mozilla Developer Network, so not the spec, slightly more interesting and easier to read formatting. We also support durations, right? So that will be Intl duration format. And instead of saying, in X days, instead describes a span of time, how long something took. And you can get incredibly specific: months, weeks, days, hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds, microseconds, and nanoseconds. As precise as you want. You have multiple styles. Digital is kind of like a clock format. I'll try to show an example of that. And you could specify different formatting for different parts of your duration. Yes, you can even say, even if I'm not specifying how many years, I still want you to show it. Very flexible, trying to match every type of use case you can think of. This is the only thing I believe that would not be supported in Firefox. As an example, I create my duration object. I am saying that I want to represent 28 hours and 19 minutes. I created my object and just ran a format on it. And we could see 28 hours, 19 minutes. That's the default English way of doing it. If we switch this, if we modify the formatting a bit, we can instead say 0 days, 28 hours, 19 minutes. I see the 0 days because I told it, always show me the days. And lastly, if you want to see a Spanish version of this, it has 28 horas y 19 minutos. And I apologize for my pronunciation. I've been told I pronounce every language horribly, horribly bad. So just some examples of what this looks like. In 1 month, that's the long style. We could do it narrow. It's 1M or MTH. This is all baked in. If we make it, let's say, in 3 hours and 23 minutes. You could see that style like so. We can get rid of the minutes, etc. You can play with this, narrow, etc. I will point out, I said I passed 3 hours and nearly 10,000 minutes. You and I know that that many minutes would be better as hours. Again, you would have to do that work to set up those values yourself. The spec here is saying, hey, you told me to specify this duration. That's what I'm going to do, even though logically it doesn't make sense. By the way, don't mix negatives like this. Let me type one in. This will throw an error. I don't have the console being shown, but you can do negative by itself like that. So negative 9 weeks. And one more thing I want to show. If I said 2 hours and 2 minutes in digital, again, this is kind of like a clock interface. And that clock interface is what MDN suggested as their way of explaining it. So I'm going for it. Number formatting. Again, going to be very, very flexible. The intl.number format spec does numbers and currencies. Can actually support numbers larger than max int. I haven't tried it, but in theory, it works. Can support units as well, and it has a lot of different units. It has kind of baked in gallons, liters, and so forth. Can also simplify. This is a feature I think is really, really cool. It could take very large numbers and just make it simple, like 100M. Has multiple baked in styles, and you can also get very specific and can also do ranges as well. So as an example, and by the way, if you have never seen this, modern browsers, when you're creating numbers, allows you to use the underscore as a separator. It makes it much easier to read large numbers. Behind the scene, these underscores are just ignored completely. But when you as a human are reading code, I could see, oh, that's 544 million. Makes it a lot easier. So I'm going to specify decimal formatting for this, and I will get, and again, in English, we use commas, and you can see it right there. And if I were to switch to French, we get spaces instead, which seems so weird, but you know, there you go. That's the way they do it. Some options, and this is not everything. It's going to blow your mind. I'm just going to go through all of these real quick here. You have a heck of a lot of options. So probably most of us know significant digits. We also probably understand fraction digits. Rounding priority, rounding increment, and rounding mode gets incredibly precise. Honestly, I had never heard of some of the options they have there. But for like things like rounding increment, if you want to round like not to whole numbers, but to like a quarter of a number, that is an option. And there's probably some banking or some other scientific thing where that makes sense. They support it. This goes down a deep rabbit hole with the TLDR basically being, if you have some super weird number formatting need that is known in the scientific or business, financial, et cetera community, I do not doubt at all that this spec would support formatting the numbers for that. Trailing zeros as well. Again, the docs, I would recommend taking a look. As an example, minimum integer digits, 2. All that basically means that it's if I have a number less than 10, pad it with a 0. I have written this code many times. Normally, actually, when I was formatting dates by hand, and so I don't need to do that anymore, but that is baked into this particular API. In terms of significant digits, so I have a number 544 million or so, and you could see I said only 4 significant digits, and you could see it rounded to 4 significant digits, which is nice. The only thing off screen there is just formatting on the input. Another example, the compact notation takes that large number and writes it as 540 M. I really, really like this feature. I know most of the time if I'm looking at a report or something and I saw this number, I would much rather see this. I have to be honest, the first time I saw this type of display, and I'm not sure if they were using the spec, but the first time I saw something like this was on Twitter, for example. My follower count was 11,000, 12,000 something, and they simplified it to like 12K or something. Not sure if they do that anymore. I'm not using Twitter anymore, but that's the first time I saw that, and I thought that was great for making stats and stuff just a little bit simpler to read. Another example, if I want actually to spell out what the thing is, 544 million, and if the locale was French, it would actually have the French spelling of million instead. And actually, I can't remember what it is. I know one of them, I think British English swaps out billion and million. One of those actually switches the word. This would handle that perfectly. So for formatting ranges, still uses formatting options. And if the two values are close, it will use an approximately equals value. And I'll show you an example of what this means. So let me actually show you the code. All I'm doing is creating a formatter and running format range on it instead of format. And I'm passing the first number and the second number. That's literally the only real change. So if I do 1 to 2, I get 1 to 2. If I did some large number like this, because I did not specify any formatting options, it's doing the default. So you see I have commas in there. If I had that compact display, it would be 18 billion to 2, or I think that's billion. By the way, that compact display does end at a trillion. Even though there are words for numbers bigger than trillion, like sextillion, septillion, etc., the spec stops at a trillion. So I mentioned that when the numbers are close enough, they'll do something interesting. I'll show you an example of this. So 1 to 2 shows 1-2. If I do 1.1, 1.5, still shows it. If I do 1.9, it still shows it. However, watch what happens when I get arbitrarily close at 4 decimal places. That is where the spec says it is so close, the value is just approximately 2. If I actually change this to 2, it still does that as well, which feels a bit weird to me. I think it should just show 2. But there you go. Now, if we want to try that 2.1, try the same thing in reverse. So 0, 1. Yeah, there we go. At 4 decimal places, it starts doing the approximation. And this symbol does change based on the locale. So that's, again, something that you don't have to worry about. For currency, it will format a number in a particular currency. And don't forget, currency not equal to locale. What I mean by that is that I could be in the French locale formatting American currency, and it will do the right thing. It will do the number the right way for France, and it'll put the currency symbol in the right place for French currency representation, but the American symbol for that. To be clear, if in your database you have a value that represents what something is worth, you know what that currency is. It's 100 American dollars. You cannot format it in francs or euros with this API. You would need to use something else to say, hey, what is right now 100 American dollars in euros, and then use currency formatting on that. I'm only being super clear about that because I actually did a demo once where I did that, and I felt really, really dumb after. So as an example, again, I have my large number. This time it's saying, instead of saying style as decimal, it's going to be style currency. And I have to specify a valid currency value, in this case, USD. And I get how we showed numbers in America. We put the dollar sign in front and commas and so forth. If I were to switch that to the French locale, but I'm still wanting to represent 500 so million dollars in USD, I changed my locale, still style currency, still USD, and you could see if in France they put the currency at the end and they have US instead of USD. That's the way they do it. Didn't know it, don't have to worry about it because we have this API. You can also do things like the compact notation with currency, which I think is pretty darn cool. And you can see there, it took that kind of large number and wrote it in a very nice shorthand, 544M. Don't forget there was also a option to actually spell the word out for millions. And there we go. Currency display name like so. Yeah, so just got a bit flustered there. So I can not only change the M to millions, I can also say when you're displaying the currency, don't use the symbol, use the name. So USD or the dollar sign was the symbol. In this case, I'm instead saying, show me the name of the currency. If you want to do that, that is an option. All right, so quick drink break. That was dates and numbers, and honestly, that is like all I cared about at first when I first discovered this spec and started playing with it. String functions are pretty darn interesting as well, and also get kind of complex. I'm going to start with list formatting. It is the intl.listFormat object. It will format a list of items and actually supports handling both and, or. So if I have 3 values and I want to render that out, it can do it as either X, Y, and Z or X, Y, or Z. I can't tell you how many times I've had an array of strings and I've written code to basically loop over, add a comma, and at the end do comma and the word and. It's actually baked into the browser, which is freaking cool. You can also drop the and or and just have it like that. Honestly, I'm not sure why you would do that because you could take an array and just use the join function with a comma, except that would not be locale specific where this would be instead. So there you go. I just answered my own question. Love when I do that. So as an example, you take an array, you create your instance of the list format object and just run .format on it. And we get cats, dogs, and books. In Spanish, again, same values, but now it's using E, I believe I pronounced that correctly, for the conjunction there instead of the word and. Obviously, the initial strings are still English, but you get the idea. So I built a little code pen here where I can just type things out. So beers, wine, cats, dogs, and computers. Just make a nice little long list. And you can see the different styles we have supported as well as conjunction versus disjunction. And that just changes it to an or. And again, unit just does the commas only. It does do a comma and a space, so that'd be better than just doing the array.join with a comma. And in theory, actually, this is a code pen. Let's actually change that to Spanish real quick and see what it does. And it should reload. We'll do X, Y, Z, beta. And if we do unit, you can see That's kind of crazy. X, there's no comma between the last three. Let's make this apples, bananas, cherries, beers, wine, and that is rendering different. I have no idea. Maybe because X and Y were in there twice. Who knows? We'll do apples again. Yeah, I did not expect that, but there it is. And again, we could switch that to conjunction, disjunction, uses an O in Spanish. We can make that shorter, narrow. That does nothing in Spanish. I do know in English, switch back to English real quick here. Let it reload, X, Y, Z. I believe short switches to an and symbol, and narrow gets rid of it completely. So flexible, pretty cool. We also have plural formatting. This, out of everything I'm showing tonight, this is the only one that I shook my head at. To be clear, this is not something where I could take the word leaf and ask the spec to tell me the plural, and it's smart enough to do leaves. It's not that. It's under the plural rules object, and it describes the plural of something or the other of something. Again, I apologize. I had a really hard time wrapping my head around this. It tells you, based on a number and a locale, what form of plural you should use. And we'll tell you the actual plural, the form of the plural. And if you think about it, in English, our rule basically is what? If it's 0 or more than 1, we say the plural, 0 cats, 2 cats, -1 cats, etc. But if it's 1, we say the singular. In other languages, it's actually a lot more complex. And what this API will do is it'll tell you which form to use, but again, it's not going to write the plural for you. So I would have to know that leaf switches to leaves. But what this API would tell me is when to use leaf versus leaves. And I'm shaking my head. This was really kind of weird. When it returns the form, it returns 0, 1, 2, few, many, or other, and you have to figure out which it is. This is going to use a select method instead of format. And let me kind of show you how this works, because this is just weird. So I put 5 as my input, and I'm using a type called cardinal. And I'm able to format 5 cats or 5 leaves. And if I do 1, it's 1 cat or 1 leaf. And the code behind this is basically doing, well, scroll past the DOM manipulation stuff. But when working with cardinal, and I'll show ordinal in a bit, I am going to say, when you tell me what rule to use based on my locale, if you return other, I'm going to use the plural. Otherwise, it's going to be 1, and I have a default for that. And I apologize. I feel like that made no sense at all. But you can see I have a default value for cat and leaf. And if at any time the spec said to use other, like for 2 or 0, then I use my hard-coded value for my plural. And I should say the same thing for -1 as well. Again, different languages actually get more complex and have different ways. So I'm totally making this up. But in Japanese, maybe it is 0 cat, 1 cat, and then 2 is something else, and 3 is something else, and then 4 to infinity is another rule. This API would tell you how to break this down. Again, this does not sit well in my brain now, but there it is. The ordinal is a way of describing the position of something. So first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so forth. And if you notice there, let's go back. The specification went from one to two to few to other, and it's other from now to, basically infinity. That's the English rule. But what I had to do, and I borrowed this from Mozilla, where basically they said, when it's one, use ST. When it's two, use ND. When it's few, which is going to match the three, use RD. And for everything else, use TH. So I said, hey, spec, what is my rule? And then based on that, get my thing at the end. And then I rendered it input plus the suffix. And if we were to change this, and for the heck of it, let's do, this is going to break everything, but let's make it, where's my formatter object right here? Let's make this Spanish and switch to ordinal, and we'll do one, and they like a totally different other, like it's only other. So maybe in Spanish, they always have whatever that suffix would be. Let's see what zero does. Yeah, so maybe in Spanish, that's just the way they do it. They always have the same suffix at the end for describing first, second, third, and fourth. I had no clue. Again, this is why this spec could actually help us out here. So that's that. Segmenting strings uses INTL segmenter. And it's basically a way to break a string into parts. Those parts could be graphemes, words, and sentences. And this will return an iterator, not an array. Why do you need something like this? I'm stealing straight from the docs. Apparently, there are languages that use no white space between strings. So as you see there, Japanese, Chinese, etc. So you could not use simple string parsing to figure out what the words are. This code, let me actually show the code behind it. I am going to make a segmenter object based on my granularity, so grapheme, word, or sentence. And then I'm going to ask the spec to segment. That's that call right there on line 13, my input up there. And then I basically use a shortcut to turn that iterator into a simple array and render it out. Let's give us some more space here. Let's say this is the end of the world. And because grapheme is going to be based on sounds, you can kind of see how it's being broken up there, or letters it looks to be. Words make a lot more sense, mostly because it will actually break apart each word and each space between them. And you could see in the data and the result, this has a is word like of true, and the space does not. So if you wanted a locale friendly way of doing a word count, you would use the spec and would work whether they have spaces or not. You would get your results back and you would filter to is word like true to get a proper word count. Now, fun stuff happens on sentences. I have one sentence and I'll say this is my next. This does not give you a is sentence like, it's just plain sentences. So that's different, all right? But you do get your sentences. I found something interesting today. If you use bad grammar and don't capitalize, it recognizes that. It says you screwed up and this is only one sentence. That could be good or bad depending on what you think. If you also forget the space between them, it considers it one sentence. Now that strikes me as potentially problematic, but it is, I guess, not following the proper rules of English. And I don't know what you would do with that. You definitely can't split on periods because that would be English only. And if I said Mr. Camden, that would break it as well. So just something to kind of keep in mind if you make use of this. As a final demo, I want to show you a simple implementation of what it means to use the spec. And what I have is I have a very kind of boring basic demo that calls an API. In this case, it is fake data, but I called my API get sales, and that's returning JavaScript dates and numbers, and it works. And you can see there are my dates and numbers and so forth. I'll show the code here. After I get my sales, I do a bit of DOM manipulation where I create an HTML string and I just print out those values as is. So not too bad, not too much lines of code. The INTL version looks a lot better. My dates are much nicer. I dropped the time values, which that was an arbitrary decision on my part for a sales report. Times don't matter. If I'm doing like sales per month, only the date does. I could have even said the day doesn't matter and just rendered the month, but I kept it there. And for sales, I kind of thought the compact display would be nice, but what I did, and hopefully this renders over Teams, if you mouse over, you see the full value. I didn't actually format that. I could have formatted that with commas and stuff, but the only real difference is after I call my API, I just called two new functions, format date and format number. And if we scroll down, you could see I'm using INTL, datetime format, all the defaults. Number format, I'm using the compact notation. By the way, in case you're wondering, this is a bit wasteful. For my 12 lines of data, I am creating a new INTL object each time. I don't think it practically matters. I could have rewritten this to create those objects and just run format. I will leave that up to you if you want to make that optimization. I thought this was nice and simple. So just to kind of show you, this added 8 lines of code or so, and I think this looks a lot better. I think this is a lot more readable, especially the dates. Like that was way too much data information. And if you wanted to, like if you were worried about browser support, you could do a quick sniff in this function and say, if no INTL, just return the object, return the value as is. So that is a option as well, but I would not worry about this. What I'm doing here is supported everywhere. But again, if you're supporting IE6 as well, that is an option. Some next steps, all of my links to docs, except for that one spec link, go to MDN. These specs do get fairly complex, especially the number one. So check MDN when you need help. There is a pretty cool INTL Explorer that goes way deep into all of the things and lets you play with stuff. And I am linking to it so you can play with it. And that is all I have. And I know I said I had a hard cutoff at 7, but I could definitely do 5 minutes. If there's no questions, I could also end as well. Y'all tell me, what do you think so far?
Ray, I think that was quite interesting. I thought coming into this, it was just, I'd be interested on an intellectual level if I never had to deal with foreign locales, but I'm seeing where I can use this and skip writing a bunch of code I did working with numbers and dates. And maybe I should have made that clearer if I'd known it, because I think this would appeal to anybody.
Absolutely. Like I've used dates and numbers in every single web app I've ever built.
Same with me. What do you think, Randy? You going to use it?
I thought it was interesting too. I mean, the one that was freaking me out, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, is the plural one. I'm like, but I don't know those many other languages. And I'm like, I never really thought about, -1, 0, and 1. And then after that, we go, cats, dogs.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's like you said, that's not what I was expecting. Interesting.
Cool. Well, if that's all you'll have, I'm going to say thank you and head out.